the Minnesota-based man with strong links to the Banner County, who claims people in the state have had enough of the aggressive immigration enforcement operation taking place in the region. Tom Frawley, who grew up near Foynes in Limerick and whose mother is from Feakle, moved to the Twin Cities over 20 years ago, where he now runs a small business and is married with 3 children. In 2005, he was a founding member of the Twin Cities Robert Emmets Hurling and Camogie Club, which now boasts 90 members and acts as a social hub for Irish expats in Minneapolis and Saint Paul. He's been telling Clare FM's Seán Lyons that Irish people who are living legally in the state are afraid to ring home for fear of being detained or deported.
So I'm originally from West Limerick, St. Senan's Parish in Foynes, Shanagolden, and I have a family in Galway and in County Clare. My mother's actually a Clare woman from Feakle, and I guess I left home to go to college in Galway, when I was 18, 19, and then I had an opportunity to come to the Twin Cities. I had a brother working over here at the time, and I'm probably in the Twin Cities now over 20 years. But when I initially came to the cities, it was during summers and stuff like that to visit my brother. But it really resonated with me. Just the it's a Midwest mindset up here. The folks are, I guess, primarily Scandinavian, some Germans. There is some Irish heritage up here as well. But yeah, it kind of resonated with me, and I kind of I connected with some expats at the time, and I made it home. I found it very welcoming at the time.
And you mentioned there is a small Irish community there, and one of the hats that you wear is that you're a founding member of Robert Emmets Hurling Club in the Twin Cities. Can you tell us about Robert Emmets? What's its mission statement, so to speak?
Yeah, when I first arrived, I guess the first thing every expat does, we were looking for where can we watch the games, the football and the hurling, and at the time there wasn't a go-to spot really, but we after a while, actually at the Irish Fair of Minnesota, we connected with some other expats. And there was a desire to go for a book around. Basically, it started at that simply, and then there was another club actually in the region in Milwaukee that had been up and running, almost like a proof of concept that hey, you could have a hurling club in a non-traditional, New York, Chicago, San Francisco kind of scenario. So we started doing organized training sessions, and I guess the missions, we didn't probably have a mission statement at the start, but it was just based on community, getting out, getting a bit of exercise, meeting your fellow expats. And early on, we realized that I think there's about 500 or 600 expats in the in Minnesota. So we realized early on that there wasn't really enough natives for a fully fledged team. So we said, hey, let's see how these Minnesotans like it, and they're big into the ice hockey and all that side of things. And
so naturally predisposed to the sport, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And we would advertise it as it's the best parts of all the other sports distilled down into this fantastic field sport. It was an easy sell, we got a couple of Americans out. We got a lot of American kind of athlete types at the start. They told their friends and family, and we did set up it up as a non-profit. And the mission statement was basically about community outreach, cultural awareness, and exposing people to the game of hurling and also the culture,
Just to move to the events of the last few weeks, Tom, Minnesota is well known as a blue state, a state that consistently votes for the Democratic Party, and we over here would associate it with Governor Tim Walz, who was Kamala Harris's running mate in the 2024 presidential election. And with that in mind, it's the type of state that you would imagine would be hostile to an increased presence of ICE agents, of immigration and customs enforcement agents. We've seen that ramped up presence in the last couple of weeks, and I'm curious, from that perspective, what has the atmosphere been like in the state? Has there been a noticeable shift in the atmosphere and the temperature?
Yeah, we're definitely in a blue bubble here in the Twin Cities, but there are areas of Minnesota, as you go outside the initial couple of rings, out to the suburbs and out to the countryside, where they maybe lean a different direction, and I think part of the problem with the way the administration and the feds have kind of come in is that they're thinking black and white. They're thinking they're putting people into certain boxes, but in reality, I think Minnesota, there was 50,000 people out marching in the freezing cold there, and I think they're kind of a pragmatic type of people. When they moved to this part of the country, they probably had to band together at times. Now, I'm not sure politics probably wasn't as divisive back then, but to answer your question, what I would say is, so I called a buddy the other day he'd be a Republican, he'd be right leaning, and you'd be a little bit nervous calling him because you see what's going on in some of these media outlets, and before I picked up the phone, I'd be thinking, geez, I hope we're on the same page on this kind of stuff. So I called him, and he said, first thing he said was the second shooting. Yeah, those guys are going to jail. It was absolutely unbelievable what happened there. So like, yes, we're in a blue state, but there are plenty people in this state that are, they lean one way or the other, but this is a watershed moment. This is a situation where it's undeniable what happened.
There's consensus among left and right, blue and red.
Absolutely, because yes, there's concern that there's an issue with immigration. That can's been kicked down the road for administration after administration after administration. And ideally, what's supposed to happen, my understanding is that, federal agents can come in, and ideally the local law enforcement are supposed to assist them and create a buffer between protesters and these ICE agents. But it just looks like they're undertrained. The surge was there isn't enough local law enforcement to assist ICE. They're stretched too thin. So people are. I think people are. They've had enough. Whatever side you're on, they've had enough, and that anger, it is brewing up, and what Governor Walz said, whether you're pro-Walz or anti-Walz or whatever, he said, protest, use your First Amendment rights, get out, voice your opinion, keep it peaceful, de-escalate, and I think that's hopefully happening now.
You're an Irish immigrant with dual citizenship in Minnesota, Tom. In the run-up to the 2024 presidential election in the US, there was a conversation taking place over here around the Irish in the US and the estimated 10,000, that was the figure that was given at the time, 10,000, although it's possibly more, Irish who are in the US illegally, and there were concerns for them given the strong rhetoric being used by Trump and his team around immigration and around deportations. Being an Irishman in Minnesota, connected to that Irish diaspora, Are you hearing anxiety from particular individuals around this immigration enforcement operation?
Yes, the short answer is yes. This immigration thing has been kicked around for, administration after administration after administration. There's folks that have been here for almost, they've got family here now, they've got kids here that are American citizens, but they're in this kind of grey area. And it was those folks that were, I guess, typically those guys and girls would always be kind of nervous. But now you've got people with green cards and visas that are wondering what's going to happen next. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like...
And these are people who mightn't necessarily have broken any laws. They might be following procedure, but even still, they don't feel secure.
Yeah, and here's the thing, Seán, I'm not saying that that's going to happen. I'm not saying that anybody's going to get picked up or anything like that. But at the same time, when emotions are high and anxiety is leading the day, people's, minds race, you know what I mean? And I guess what I would say is, yeah, I have friends and acquaintances that would be nervous to pick up the phone and talk to people back home who have visas, people that have visas and people that are here legally, because it just seems to be like there's no make or shape to what they're doing. It just seems to be, it just seems to be seat of the pants stuff. Like like I say, I've conservative friends that are, one conservative buddy said, yeah, there's a situation here. There are bad guys getting over the border and all that kind of stuff, and the argument on the right is, well, we need people on the ground, so we have to push through the training. We've got apparently it was reduced down to 6 weeks, so you could apply, get in. Do your 6-week training, and then you're out on the street. Now, this is just what I've heard. I don't know if this is factual or not. Somebody may have to do a fact check or whatever. Mm-hmm. But he made the analogy like that. Okay, so like if you were short airplane pilots, like would you shorten the period of time for somebody to get a license, a license to fly an airplane
when the stakes are so high?
Yeah, no, you wouldn't, and there's no excuse, ultimately it's hard not to get elevated and, when you're having these discussions, but like there has to be some negligence there, whoever has organized this, like I said, I think this idea that all this stuff needs to be investigated now. They're not going to need much of an investigation for what happened on Saturday. They probably need to start investigating. Okay, what are the qualifications of getting into this federal police force or whatever, So,
and indeed, we've seen the advertisements which say no undergraduate degree required. They seem to be flaunting this idea that there isn't particularly prohibitive training involved.
Yeah, they should open up and let people know, okay, who's getting in here? What are the qualifications? Because there probably are people in there that are trying to do good work, you know what I mean? But the people that are front and centre, they look absolutely unqualified, dysregulated,
incompetent. Yeah.
So,
just looking ahead on this issue, Tom, we know now that in response to the pressure, Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino, who's been overseeing ISIS operations in the Twin Cities, has been demoted, and he's expected to leave the state now. But of course, Trump has confirmed that the border czar Tom Homan will come to Minnesota to essentially fill that role. So it doesn't look like, as yet, at the time of this conversation, that any significant change is afoot. How do you see this playing out? Is there a sense that there is a shift in tone from the administration and that the operations of ICE could be scaled down, or will this episode be lingering on for a while yet?
I'd imagine it'll go down to the politicking. It'll go down to the politics, how the numbers look, all that kind of stuff. It's a terrible thing to say, but you'd hope that there's reasonable people in the administration that are going to step in because it's the right thing to do. But I'd imagine that if it's a very unpopular situation, that they'll absolutely jump in and they'll make adjustments, because what's the alternative? You know what I mean? People in Minnesota are very resilient, and I'm just a local guy with kids in the local school. I'm not out. I didn't go out to marches or anything like that, but what's the alternative? You can't keep doubling down on this, because it's just going to keep escalating. The local leaders after the first shooting said, hey, we need to pause. We need to have a transparent investigation. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. That advice wasn't heeded. Now, within a week, or a couple of 10 days, whatever it was, there's another situation. So to answer your question, I don't know a lot about that guy, but he seems to be like a career guy. He's 30 years in it. You'd hope that he'd be professional. You'd hope that he'd be impartial. It sounds like that he's been there through multiple administrations. The idea is, when you're in these positions, I think you're supposed to be impartial. And my understanding is that the local law enforcement, what they're saying is that, hey, we had a kind of a system down before this surge back in October. We were kind of working hand in hand. But since the surge, they're outnumbered. They literally can't assist the local folks. So to answer your question, who knows? But I'd imagine that the optics are absolutely terrible, and you'd hope that common sense would prevail at the end of the day.